So the attention economy is this business of getting people hooked on technology. The tech companies, generally the tech companies that function on an advertising revenue model are the biggest players in this, because what they need is they need you to spend more time staring and tapping at the screen on their platform, because the more of that you do, the more ads they can serve and the greater their revenue.
Welcome to the Ikario podcast once again, where we help you break free from the human zoo, achieve your full, truest potential, and become a force to be reckoned with your hosts, Ollie, myself, and
I'm Shane. And today we're following up on the episode from last week about the human zoo. So we've defined what the human zoo is and why we need to break out. And today, this is really a continuation, although it will also make sense to you if you haven't listened to the previous episode. Because the theme here is that we live in a world where the ability to opt out is becoming more and more important. And the very short story here is that this is because of the human zoo. It's because more and more elements of the world we live in are bad for us. If we cannot manage our impulses and opt out, which is to say deliberately choose to not participate in certain things, then we are bound for misery. In a way, this is one of the things that has happened with our civilization, especially in the last 100 years or so. It looks to me like, if you think of like all the things happening and all the things available to you as a pie chart, the part of the pie that you need to opt out of in order to have a chance at wealth, health, and happiness is growing, and is growing rapidly lately. So there's more and more stuff you have to opt out of. Now, we'll talk about this in terms of examples, or by just talking through some practical examples, because I don't want this to be just theoretical. I want to get down to the brass tacks of what to do. And we'll have two easy examples and two difficult examples. We'll start with the easy example. We talked in the last episode as well about food. I think food is an easy example because you can clearly see, like we talked about, right? The floor space in a supermarket, like most of it is dedicated to food that is bad for you. If you walk around a supermarket and you kind of equally take food from all shelves, you will end up with a really bad diet that could literally kill you. You will end up with a diet that has way too much sugar in it, for example. And eating too much sugar like that will cause diabetes, and diabetes will eventually kill you, right? Even though, of course, diabetes, for example, is a condition that we can manage quite well now. But still, the fact is, even though we found a workaround, the fact is that the consumption of this food kills you. So you have to opt out of a lot of things that are available in the supermarket. Or another way to think of this is that you have, as a human animal, you have all these impulses, and you want food, and you want tasty food. And you have to, because we live in an area in an era of abundance, of overabundance, one of the things you have to do in order to be able to thrive as a human being is you have to manage these impulses. You have to be able to recognize that, yes, I see that, shiny, bright packaging of cookies, and yes, I would really enjoy eating those cookies, but I have to manage that part of myself, and I have to find a way to resist that urge. And if I don't find a way to resist that urge, then essentially someone else is winning at my expense.
+1 for meditation. I'm going to keep plugging that. Yeah. I'm going to shoehorn that recommendation into as many episodes as I possibly can, just because there's so many things it helps with. And managing impulses is one of them. It's one of these weird little bits of advice I used to give my personal training clients. It's like, I emotionally eat, I binge eat and all these things, I struggle. It's like, okay, start meditating. Like, what? Like, trust me, do this. And you just notice that a craving of any kind, it's really cool because when you meditate for a while, you start to recognize and become curious towards a craving feeling. But usually it's like the craving will come in, it will prompt a behavior. It will usually
it just takes over.
Yeah, right? It will usually be a sensation in the body first, and then behavior will soon follow. Now, for most people, the gap between or like a cue in the environment, emotional response, and then behavior change, which is just go and eat something, is very, very narrow. It's extremely narrow. Like more or less, as soon as you're in the supermarket for a lot of people, as soon as you've seen white chocolate covered Oreos, you're already going, oh, brilliant. How many of these can I buy? Oh, decent deal. And then they're in the basket before you know it. But if you meditate regularly, you increase the gap between cue, craving, and reward. And that's not just for the stuff related to food, like any emotional response that would lead to a behavior. So I plugged meditation. There you go. I've plugged meditation for this episode. It may come up again.
yeah. And it's 100% true. I think that with meditation, another thing that you learn when you meditate is that something comes along, something rises and then fades again.
Mm-hmm.
And you have that with thoughts, right? You're sitting there and the thought comes along and says, this is urgent. You have to think about this. This is important. But if you just let it be, then it will just kind of fade away. And it turned out it wasn't important. And an impulse that suggests you have to get these chocolate covered Oreos is like that. It feels really important and urgent in the moment. And if you give into it, then it's like, that resolves the impulse. But if you just leave it, eventually it will just go away.
Yeah, eventually it passes. In mindfulness, they call it urge surfing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you get an urge come up, it's a wave. And most people, the wave comes up, it's like the only way to relieve this tension. And if you notice a craving or an urge, it's a physically tense sensation in the body. A craving's there, it's like it causes you to tighten up, it's like you can't concentrate as much, etc. It's like, okay, I need to get rid of this as soon as possible, which most people do.
And since we wanted to make this practical, this is great because this is something very practical to do. There's two modes of doing this: the easier mode and then the hardcore mode. And urge surfing is the hardcore mode. So the easier mode is 10-minute rule. It's just a 10-minute rule where you can try this out, where you basically allow yourself any indulgence, but always with a gap of 10 minutes. So if right now I'm thinking, I want cookies, then I just start a timer of 10 minutes. And in those 10 minutes, I'm not having cookies. After 10 minutes, I can decide, do I still want cookies? And this is a super simple rule where just any urge you have, anything you have that is, distracting or that is unhealthy or all the stuff that you usually struggle with, you say, I can have everything. I can have all the things I want, but there's just always a buffer of 10 minutes. And most things, by the time 10 minutes are over, you're just not interested anymore. And then the hardcore version of this is urge surfing. And urge surfing, so I know of the experimental condition of this. I read about an experiment with this with smokers. And it's really interesting introspective exercise where you basically wait until you want to smoke a cigarette. And then you pay attention to that urge. And you try to really tune into the feeling of, I want a cigarette. And then when the feeling starts fading, you increase the stimulus. So then you get out a package of cigarettes and look at it. And then usually you feel a rise. And then you pay attention to that. You really ride that wave of, I want to smoke. And then when that fades, like you get out a cigarette and you look at it. And when that fades, you smell it. And you eventually put it in your mouth without lighting it. So you basically try to push the desire for the cigarette to the max and just always feel that and always ride it out.
And eventually you light it and smoke it and then smoke another one and then just keep smoking them. And then what was the point?
Well, usually I think the idea is to stop short of actually smoking it. But yeah, and apparently it does something that really helps people overcome the urge to quite a surprising degree.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's something that's a specific technique to deploy in order to do the opting out. So opting out of cigarettes, for example.
Yeah, and when it comes to food, it's really funny. Something that just came up was one of my favorite comedians who's died now, a guy called Patrice O'Neill. And he developed diabetes. It was a really, really he was a big guy. And he was talking about how he's got diabetes and he needs to keep taking insulin. And he says it's really weird because the kind of food that they're coming out with now, it's really hard. You start having these really strange thoughts. You just see these, because he used the example of like caramel covered Oreos and stuff. He goes, you see those in the shop and you're just like, I don't need both my feet. That's how he rationalized it to himself. I don't need both of them. I could eat these. I could lose one, and then maybe that's okay.
Yeah. Damn. All right. So that's the example of food. Like I said, this is an easy example. The second easy example for why we need to opt out, or why opting out is crucial for living a good life, because that's the point. Again, I just want to remind, that's the point, is that if you don't do this, if you don't opt out, if you don't control your impulses, you're bound for misery. And maybe you're one of the lucky people who doesn't struggle with food. I think one of the reasons the example comes up for me is because I struggle with food a lot. I can very easily overeat. And I have very strong impulses that, for me, it's very clear. If I followed all my impulses, I'd be dead by now already, clearly. These impulses run rampant within me, But I think some people are lucky and don't have that much of a struggle. But one of these examples is going to get you.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate. For me, as we've talked before, for me, it's Uber Eats. But to be honest with you, I'll be broke, and I'll die from being broke of ordering Uber Eats before diabetes or heart disease will get me. I'll just be in the streets, just like, I need money for pizza. Uber Eats pizza, please. That would be my fate.
Yeah. Which is also not a great way to thrive as a human being. So
definitely not.
The point stands. So, okay, the next example is also a fairly easy example. It's basically materialism and consumerism, where I think we basically have battling cultural narratives. Because on the one hand, we have a stream of storytelling essentially in our culture that says the solution to everything is to buy something. And happiness means buying things. And, that's basically how you get everything, right? You want to be happy, buy things. You want to be even happier, like buy expensive vacations, go to luxurious places. You want to be seen as, you want to get validation. You want to be important, buy expensive clothes, be seen wearing expensive things and doing expensive things. It's basically, and if something hurts here, buy a pill, right? It's basically everything. The solution is always buy things. And the goal is buy more things, because sure, maybe you have a house, but you could have a bigger house, maybe you have a phone or a computer, but you could have a better phone and a newer computer. I mean, come on.
You work hard all the time. You've earned this.
Exactly. And of course, there's an unlimited amount of things we can always buy and that are always being advertised to us. And that's like one of and I call this a cultural narrative because it is more than just advertising, suggesting, hey, you buy a new couch or whatever. It is a justification for so many things. You should study hard and work hard and so on and so forth. Why? So that you can have more money, right? And then what you do with the money? Well, you buy things. So, and of course, the other aspect, there is also the aspect of freedom and power that comes with money. But let's be real. Most of us are chasing money because we want to buy things. And most of us, that's what we do with most of our money. We buy stuff we don't need.
That cycle, man. I think Alan Watts called that all retch and no vomit. It never gets there. You're always just doing something for the next thing.
Yeah.
And there's never any satisfaction because you're always working to this other point that when it arrives, you're just still looking at this next point.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing is that there is a counter narrative in our culture as well. Every one of us has heard thousands of stories about how this doesn't work out. Everybody knows essentially, or at least everybody has been told and reminded many times that, hey, what actually happens when you finally buy the thing is you just want another thing. And when you finally have all this money, you just want more money. But right now you're comparing yourself to people who have 10 times more money than you. And if you had $1 million, then you'd compare yourself to people who have $10 million. And if you have $10 million, you compare yourself to people who have $100 million and so on. It just never ends. And basically, we've been told again and again, look, it doesn't work. Whatever you're trying to solve by buying things, the solution is not at the end of the next purchase. So, and also, I think because we live in a consumer culture, we've all been through this cycle many, many times ourselves. Which is the thing we really want, and maybe we save up for, and it's so important. Before we have it, it's so important. Then you buy it, and once you have it, it's just whatever. And then you want the next thing.
Yeah, this narrative, what comes up for me now is like this narrative is, it's like modern people are primed for this narrative, because mostly people are not religious or living in a philosophically charged way. So it's like they're sort of primed to believe the story of the purpose is to keep going and keep earning and keep going to the next thing, keep buying the next thing. Salvation is at the next purchase kind of thing. Like a shopping mall full of Buddhists would be the worst shopping mall. It's shut down in a week because it's just like we've already found that this buying stuff doesn't do this. But for people who are kind of philosophically, spiritually void, hungry, without any sense of meaning or purpose, and then you just have a giant billboard that's like, you know what, I could be like Daniel Craig. Look at that dude wearing that watch. That guy doesn't worry about these existential problems. I need to be like that dude.
Yeah.
I could look like that guy. That's a good goal.
Yeah.
It's like
yeah.
it's just primed for that, you know.
Unfortunately, I don't know where this quote is from, but this quote comes to mind, which is very simple. Not wanting something is as good as having it.
Oh my God. Oh God. It is, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I need that 10,000, you know, I've just got this 10,000 quid Rolex. And I got the satisfaction of that. Like, I don't need a Rolex. And you actually know you don't. Like, the satisfaction's around the same, isn't it?
It's the same.
God damn it.
So not wanting something is as good as having it. So to go back to the theme of opting out, this is just another example where clearly you have to manage your impulses. Because if you follow the cultural narrative of buy your way to happiness and you make use of all the easy ways to get yourself in debt, to get things more quickly, again, that is a recipe for misery. You can very quickly derail your life, as unfortunately many, many people do. Derail your life by getting in debt, paying for things that you actually never even needed. And that is something where, just like with the food, you have to find a way to manage your impulses. You have to find a way to cultivate not wanting things, over chasing things again and again at your own peril. So again, this is easy to get behind. So let's get into something a bit more difficult. Here's an example of how opting out is becoming more important in our world. That is a bit more difficult. And it's social media and more specifically the attention economy. So the attention economy is a thing that we all live in, and some poor sods don't know, or many poor sods don't realize that they live in the attention economy. So the attention economy is the economy where the thing that's being traded is human attention. And this is big, big game. This is very important. This is very important for many, many billions of dollars going around in the world. But even here, look, we can start with an easy example that we also mentioned last time, which would be porn. It's clear to see that if you don't control your impulses around porn, you can very easily, it can become self-destructive. It's clear to see that if someone's sitting at home, jerking off to porn several hours a day, that is clearly not good for that human being. And so we must manage our impulses somehow. We can clearly see that basically there's unlimited porn available, so you're never going to get through all of it. So
watch me.
Challenge accepted. And yeah, we can clearly see that you have to manage your impulses and find some. The ideal amount of porn is clearly not all of it, right? It's clearly not all of it. Maybe it's not zero, right? Maybe it's zero. I think it's debatable if, should you basically never look at it as totally poisonous, or is there some healthy amount? That's debatable, but we can clearly say that, between all the porn and zero porn, the ideal for human thriving is much closer to zero than to all of it.
Definitely.
So similarly, and similarly, there are many other things that we do with technology and on screens where we have this same problem. Where if you ask yourself, if you could design your life, like if you kind of stepped out of being the protagonist of your life, and you could design your life, and you would be like, okay, how do I what do I want my life to look like in terms of how do I want to spend the hours of my life in order to have the best life? Because that's what we ultimately want, right? We want to live the best life we can live while we're here. And you know, imagine it like on a computer interface, you know, you have like different sliders for different activities where you can allocate how many hours a day is my character going to spend doing these things. I think we can all agree that nobody would set the slider of, you know, look at the phone and scroll through social media feeds. Nobody would set that at like 8 hours a day. But that's what a lot of people are spending something between 4 and 8 hours or even beyond that a day on phone screens. And much of that time is spent on social media.
Yeah.
So there's a clear disconnect between something that we recognize to be good for us and what we actually do. Right?
Yeah.
We clearly recognize this is a problem, but our behavior, and because our brains have been hijacked by this technology, that's how we end up doing this, right? It's like we're doing this against our own best interest. So the attention economy is essentially this business of getting people hooked on technology. And the tech companies, generally the tech companies that function on an advertising revenue model are the biggest players in this, because what they need is they need you to spend more time staring and tapping at the screen on their platform, because the more of that you do, the more ads they can serve and the greater their revenue. But there are also other businesses that are participating, such as Netflix, for example, which is obviously not ad supported. It is subscriber supported, but they are also explicitly, by the way, involved in this game of trying to maximize the time everybody spends looking at Netflix.
Seems like they're being pretty successful at that.
Yes. And there is also, and this is where we get into persuasive tech, which is probably the most important in terms of the attention economy and in terms of all the money being made there. Essentially, the most important branch of research is behavior or habit forming technology. And this is, this is very sophisticated at this point. Like, we're very good at creating technology that is habit forming, that gets people hooked. And a simple example of this, let me give you 2 examples that you'll probably start noticing everywhere. And these are, trust me, this is barely scratching the surface. But one of them is the infinite scroll, where you have a feed of some sort and you're scrolling through that feed and it never ends. Because if you get to the bottom and you'd have to click on something like load more, or there's a pagination, you get to the end of page 1 and you have to click page 2, that's a so-called stopping signal, right? Where you're scrolling through the feed, you get to the end, and at that point you're asked to make a decision. Do you want to continue or do you want to go on with your life? And one of the things we figured out with persuasive tech is remove the stopping signal. Just make sure there's always another thing coming. You can never get to the bottom of the thing, right? So that is something that loads of persuasive tech apps and companies are making use of. And the other thing is variable rewards. Variable rewards is basically the one-armed bandit. You pull the thing and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, sometimes you win big, but you don't know. And variable rewards are more habit forming than predictable rewards. So if you have a notification, so a notification is the typical example of variable reward, right? The phone makes a noise and that this is a message. And it could be a positive message. It could be a message that, hey, you got 1,000 likes. It could be a message. It could even be like a direct message from a friend telling you something that makes you happy. It could be bad news too. It could be someone telling you something that's negative. Or it could be kind of meh. But you don't know until you follow the impulse to open this thing up. And that is something that gets you hooked much more so than if you knew every time I hear this sound, it's going to be this rewarding. Every time reliably. You'd lose interest pretty quickly.
That's a quirk of the mammalian brain because they discovered that on rats.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they had rats press buttons with different results. One button, get a treat every time. One button, no treats. One button, treats sometimes. Mm-hmm. The rats would just swarm around the button where there's a treat sometimes, which makes absolutely no sense Because if the goal was food, then it'd be, bring it on.
Yeah.
Let's just get fat on all these treats.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't. For some reason, their brain wired them and just geared them towards pressing the button where the reward's intermittent.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
Exactly. So, these are just some of the ways, and like the technology we use is just chock full of little things like that are really good at getting us hooked. And this also is based on the biggest data set we've ever had. The biggest data set on human behavior comes from social media use. And the most advanced machine learning in the world and some of the smartest people in the world are working on how do we get people more addicted. And that's what you're pitched against, right? Your individual little human brain is pitched against some of the most awesome technology that has ever existed, which is working against your interests.
But it's still the individual's fault. So it's still the individual's fault for a lack of self-control.
It's definitely, yeah.
That's the problem.
Anyway, if you don't know what we're talking about, watch the previous episode. So, okay, so that's the attention economy. And this is why you need to opt out, because you're basically being puppeted for the interests of the companies running these platforms. And this, just like the food, just like the porn, this is a recipe for misery. And so you have to opt out. You have to find ways to manage these impulses and not just be all in on this. If you're all in on this, that is a recipe for misery. Some great resources on this that I recommend to take a deeper look at this and to gain more awareness of this are The Social Dilemma, a documentary on Netflix, I believe. And then Your Undivided Attention is a podcast with Tristan Harris. And Tristan Harris is like is kind of the spokesperson of sane technology. Very recommended. Like Your Undivided Attention podcast is great. Then there's a book, 10 Reasons to Delete Your Social Media Right Now by Jaron Lanier. It's a good basic read. And another one is Zucked by Roger McNamee. If you read these books, it gives you a pretty good behind the scenes look at what's going on in the attention economy. And it will help you understand why some people, myself included, are pretty worried about this. Now, another problem here, and we've talked in the last episode about the thing with incentives. So is this just like a cabal of evil people who try to manipulate us or whatever? No, it's just incentives. This is how they make money. And in order to make more money, they have to get better at extracting value. And the problem is the value they're extracting is human attention. They're basically digging around in our brains to extract value. And they're getting very, very good at this. And yeah, they're just incentivized to do that because that's how they make money and they have to keep their shareholders happy and all that. You know the song and dance about why companies keep doing evil stuff, right?
Unfortunately.
Now, another problem here is, and this is often the way players in the attention economy try to wash their hands of this problem, is it's just human nature. Isn't it just human nature? I mean, the algorithm is just serving people what they want. And this is yes and no. So there is a quirk in human nature that is a problem, again, that basically means we have to manage this actively. We have to opt out. And that quirk is simply the negativity bias. The negativity bias is that the emotional strength of negative feelings is greater than that of positive feelings. We pay more attention to negative feelings than positive feelings. And for example, as a simple example of that, losing $10 feels worse, feels more bad than finding $10 feels good. So if you find $10, you feel good, and then you lose $10, you feel worse than before you found the $10, right? Where actually you should feel neutral logically, but it feels worse to lose something than it feels good to gain something. Now, this is usually explained, for evolutionary reasons. If you're kind of negative and frightful, if you hear a rustling in the bush and you think that might be a tiger, well, if it is a tiger, then maybe you survive thanks to your pessimism. If it's not a tiger, nothing bad happens. Whereas someone who isn't as worried, someone who isn't as neurotic, and who thinks, I bet it's not a tiger. Well, if it is, now you're dead.
Most of those that haven't survived.
Yeah,
most of those got eaten
this far.
Or they got a disease or they ate something.
Yeah. So that would explain why we why it makes sense to pay more attention to potentially negative signals than to positive ones. Or also equally, right? If there's a potential reward of food, but a potential danger of death, it makes sense to pay more attention to the danger and say, never mind about the food, I'll live to eat another day, right? So that could be a possible explanation for why we have a negativity bias. And of course, if you then have systems, if you have machine learning systems that are optimizing for engagement, how do we get people's attention? How do we keep people's attention? What it tends towards is fear and outrage and other such negative emotions. And this is the explanation for why, especially YouTube, I think, has most publicly come under fire for this, for like the radicalization, right? You watch a video, and in the related videos, you'll find something that is like slightly more extreme, and that's just slightly more leaning towards anger, outrage, conspiracy, danger. And then if you watch that, there's something more extreme recommended. And you watch that and so on, it kind of pushes you down almost a funnel of negative emotions. Because if you can shove someone into a position where they have, think about like the ultimate paranoid conspiracy theorist, where if you're retreated far enough into a position of fearing conspiracy, everything can be interpreted as danger. Everything. It's like, oh, today is an especially quiet day. The news is not reporting anything bad. That must mean something really bad has happened, right? Because obviously they're always lying. So and also this is then a manipulation thing. If you get people paranoid enough, it's much easier to control everything that they believe, because you can always say, oh, look, this is evidence that seems to support what I say is evidence that I'm right. Evidence that seems to support the opposite is evidence that everybody's lying to you and you can't trust them. So in this way, simply maximizing for people's attention will create more and more negativity. And then because we are the creators of social media and there are incentives, if I create social media that gets more views, that gets a wider audience and so on, then I make money. I make more money. And again, YouTube is a great example of this because it's pretty direct. If I have more views, I'll get more ad serves, and through the ad split, I get more money. And so because of this negativity bias and because of the optimization, it creates the incentive for creating outrageous, fear-based, negative content. So as a content creator, whether I'm aware of this or not, and I think a lot of content creators are not aware of this, they're simply following what they see works. I make a video that is, that is not outrageous and negative and horrible. I don't get that many views. I don't get a lot of money. Then I make a video where I'm really angry at whoever, and it gets more views and I make more money. Well, obviously, I want to make more money, so I'm going to keep making. So even the creators are basically being shoved down into these little cones of fear and conspiracy, and their audience go along with them.
Yeah. It's related to incentives, this, isn't it?
Yeah.
If their incentives is to get more ad money, then that incentive drowns out the incentive to to provide content that's not so damaging.
Yeah.
If that's the main incentive, then they're going to do that.
Yeah. And I also think that most of them are sincere in the sense that people who make super angry content all the time, they are actually genuinely angry and afraid and so on. I think most of them are not like putting on a show just to make money. It's like they themselves, right? Because they're participants and creators at the same time. So they're consuming all this stuff too. So I think in the end, it's probably most of it is probably sincere. Most of the overly paranoid, angry, outraged stuff is people who sincerely feel that way and are basically sharing it, and they happen to get rewarded for it. And in that sense, this is also a term that we use often, is the term algorithm puppet. So people become algorithm puppets, and really, if you look at it from that perspective, you can see that it is the algorithm that creates content much more than it is people that create content. because of the whole reward system and because of what signal gets boosted and so on. Ultimately, it's the algorithm that creates content.
And it says, I'm sure we're going to discuss social media on another episode at some point, but it goes as far eventually as to say that the algorithm starts to create people, starts to influence people's behavior to such a degree where that's like a person's becoming a reflection of the algorithm.
Yeah. So that is the thing that's currently tearing apart society in many parts of the world. And if you're wondering how bad this is, it's much worse than I've made it sound so far. And if you listen to the Your Undivided Attention podcast, you get an idea of this, because in many places, this kind of way that social media works is being exploited in pretty extreme ways. So, for example, there are people like Nina Schick. I heard from her on the Making Sense podcast, and Fadi Quran, who was on the Undivided Attention podcast. They talk about the effects that this has on entire nations, where this is essentially being wielded as a political, as a political weapon, and on things like bullying, for example, where again, like it creates this system that makes bullying, that enables bullying to a degree that pre-social media people are not aware of and that haven't experienced, but that young people on social media are experiencing, like, to really traumatic levels. And yeah, basically, if you look at Tristan Harris's work, you can see just how bad this can get. Because I think what most of us think is like, yeah, maybe it's problematic, but it's just people wasting their time. And it's just like, or something you often hear is like, well, I'd rather be shown a personalized ad than an unpersonalized one. So what's the problem with all this data harvesting and so on? It's like that barely scratches the surface of the problem. And I recommend taking a bit of a deeper look at this because, yeah, it is pretty terrifying. But the bottom line is, again, as an individual, you want to live a good life, you got to opt out. You cannot be puppeted about by Facebook and co. And for your mental health, it's just instrumental. How do you do this in practice? Well, look, the easiest thing to do is just to delete all this stuff, especially if you're lucky enough to not be, like, I think if you're a teenager and basically you grow up in a world of social media and everything in your life is happening on social media and so on, you're basically not really aware of a pre-social media world. I think it's much more difficult to disentangle yourself. If you're lucky enough to be a bit older so that you're still, it's like you weren't born in a world of social media, it's much easier to step out and you just don't have to use social media. It's just so much easier. And just tell people, basically you can have a group chat to stay in touch with your friends. You can have, just delete this stuff off your phone. Just stop using it. It's one of the easiest ways to improve life quality. And I think you have a personal experience with this, right?
You won't regret it. You really won't regret it. So I think I left social media, was it in April? Yeah, it was in roughly April because I made a YouTube video about it. So it's been about 6 months now. And now for the first sort of 30 days, it was a bit weird because I just felt lonely. And I felt like in the absence of bombarding my consciousness with all these dopamine hits, I kind of felt a little bit sad for a while. There was just some stuff that I was avoiding through social media that I couldn't avoid anymore. So that was like the first month. But after that, it just felt like I could pay attention again. That was really quite a weird thing because I thought I could pay attention before, but I actually couldn't. I noticed that if I was watching a movie, I couldn't just sit and watch a movie. I'd be watching a movie and it just wouldn't be moving quickly enough for me or whatever else, and I'd reach for the phone. So I'd have phone scrolling while movie going on at the same time. Mm-hmm. And it's like, Jesus Christ, if you can't pay attention to a movie, even a great movie, then you obviously can't pay attention to like work or anything, which was another problem, that I couldn't sit there and just actually do a work task for, say, an hour without constantly checking my phone and stuff. But It's like, yeah, the first sort of month or two, it might be a bit rough, first month. But after a while, it just feels like you've been walking around with boots full of cement and then you just take them off and then walk around. It's like, damn, I'm free,
Yeah.
So Yeah, just do it. I love the sentiment of just get rid of it.
Yeah.
It sounds like, because for me it felt like a real powerful gesture. I was like, I'm about to jump off a cliff. I was like, jump off the cliff. Seriously, jump off the goddamn cliff.
And you can always come back, if you're worried about it, just leave for like 30 days or something. You can always come back, right? You don't lose anything. And you can you can show your brain what it's like to not be exposed to this all the time. So a couple of other specific things you can do to opt out of the attention economy is, so first of all, use ad blockers. Absolutely use ad blockers. Simply because of this, look, of course you can say, well, but I want to support creators and websites and stuff. Yeah, but let's do it not using ads. Let's opt out of this shitty system that's causing so much destruction. So use ad blockers. Use something like uBlock Origin. Use OneBlock on iOS. Just make sure you never see an ad again. You should not be, like, I'm not categorically against ads, but the amount of ads that we see on the internet and the way the whole ad business works, just opt out. For me, it's like, sure, look, I do want to support creators. And for example, I use YouTube Premium so that when I watch someone's video, they still get paid. And I support creators on Patreon, and I like buying things from people, basically. If I like what you do, let me buy something from you. Let's not do the whole nonsense where I'm watching all these ads and then there's sponsorships and there's all this other stuff. Let's just opt out of that. So use ad blockers. And one of the ways to think of it is like, look, if you have a kid, make sure that their devices are ad blocked, because you don't want your kid to be subjected to an endless barrage of advertising, right? Well, the same is true for me. I don't want me to be subjected to that shit either. So use ad blockers. You can also, instead of, so you get off of all this algorithmic stuff. You don't want to be scrolling through algorithmically curated feeds. And what you can do instead is you can curate your own feed. This is pretty old school, but you can still do this. You can use something like Feedly. And basically, if there are specific stories you want to keep up on or specific websites you want to follow or something like that, you can make your own feed, which is basically one place where you can see all the updates from all your favorite writers, all your favorite creators, and so on. But it's not this algorithmic nonsense where it's always trying to shove something in front of that thing that gets more of your attention and that actually detracts from the people you originally wanted to follow, right? So you can curate your own feeds. And you can also I recommend that you just get out of the Google and Facebook ecosystems. And this can be quite difficult. For me, this is still a work in progress, especially with Google. I'm still in the Google ecosystem, but I'm like step by step, removing one app after another. And so
I'm looking at your Apple Watch right now. So that's the start of it. That's the beginning.
I switched to Apple recently. I switched away from Android recently for that reason, because I'm getting more and more uncomfortable using things that are Google or Facebook related. And I'd been on Android for ages and ages, but that was the thing where I was just like, okay, I want to get out of this. And Apple specifically, brand themselves as a privacy company. So that's really the main reason I made that jump. And yeah, other ways to get out of the ecosystems. So instead of social media, to keep in touch with friends, get your friends on Telegram, not WhatsApp, because WhatsApp is also owned by Facebook. Get them on Telegram and you can have your group chats and stuff there. So that's how you can keep in touch with friends. And something like Telegram is basically can be used like a non-algorithmic social media, because guess what? People can post updates, they can post videos, they can post memes and pictures and so on and so forth. But it's just no interference from some system that's constantly trying to get its claws in your brain.
I mean, sorry, just one thing I wanted to mention is, so what came up just then was, so if you switch to Telegram instead, I mean, no matter what, if you opt out, you're making sacrifices, right? It's not like you can get off of Facebook and Instagram and stuff and use a different kind of software or a different app and be like, have all the benefits of this, but without the downside. No, there are downsides to leaving, obviously. There are reasons why you would want to stick around. Like I used to use groups a lot. I met people through groups. I used events. It was really convenient to have Facebook Messenger on my phone and to know that pretty much anyone I find on Facebook will be on Messenger, and pretty much anyone I find and meet in the real world will be on Facebook. It makes things pretty seamless. However, the point is, what's it costing you? So it's not as if by leaving social media and opting out, there's no downsides. No, be prepared for the downsides, but just know that what you're gaining from it is so much more important than the most important upsides of being on social media. That's how I rectified it in my own brain. Not to kind of be like, leave and be like, try and find other solutions to this and that. You can do that, but I didn't put the energy into it personally. I just knew that it was going to be a sacrifice, but I knew that my own personal attention, my ability to focus, my mental well-being was far more important than the benefits I was getting.
Mm-hmm.
And a kind of indignation at the fact that my attention had been hijacked for so long by people who just didn't know or care about me at all.
Yeah.
That kind of just pissed me off.
Yeah.
It was like, fuck them.
Yeah. And I think it's well said, right? Yeah, you are giving things up, but the things that you're gaining are so much more profound and so much more important. But yeah, just to continue my quick list of things to do, like practical things to do, right? To step out of the ecosystem. So don't use log in with Facebook, log in with Google type features on websites. Use Firefox. On Apple, perhaps, I don't know. I think Firefox is kind of crippled on Apple. I'm not sure. Something weird's going on there. So maybe Safari is what you use there. But on a Windows machine, for sure, use Firefox. Firefox, excellent. And, instead of Chrome, basically. And it also, you can use the Facebook container add-on, which kind of, even if you go on a website that is Facebook affiliated or has a Facebook pixel on it, it kind of creates a container that doesn't let that thing follow you around the rest of the internet.
Imprison it.
Yeah.
Put it in a cage.
And then you can also look at switching.software. Switching.software is a website, and privacytools.io is a website where you can just find alternatives to the software you're currently using that's provided by these companies. And like I said, this is a slow progress. So for me, I was very deep in the Google ecosystem a few years ago. And I originally wanted to jump all the way out at one point, but I just realized it is too difficult, especially because I use, for example, Google Drive for my businesses. And, moving everyone on all the teams and so on off of that is just pretty significant undertaking. So what I decided to do instead is just to take it step by step. And so it's like one by one over time, I've just moved out of these different apps. And I think it's perfectly fine to take it slow. But those are the practical things to do. Which brings us to the final example I want to talk about of something you need to opt out in order to have a better life.
In order to have a chance.
Yeah. And that is, and this is another hard example that a lot of people might take very personally or find very difficult to contend with. But it is what I call political games and us versus them frames. So with politics is also a game of basically manipulating people's attention and manipulating people's sense of reality and sense of what's right and wrong and so on in order to, against their own interests. In most cases, a lot of politics is how can we package up what we want in such a way that you will vote for it, right? That's how democracy works in most places. It's like, what I want is not good for you, so how do I package this up and sell this so that you are going to approve of it somehow, right? And so one of the problems is the power games of politics. This is, one of the oldest tricks in the book, which is still being used, is divide and conquer. So if I'm in power and I want to be able to get away with my shenanigans, what do I do? If I just do my shenanigans and you find out about it, I'm going to be in trouble. So what I can do is I can divide and conquer. If I can make sure that you guys, instead of being worried about what I'm up to, are turning towards each other and fighting each other, that makes it much easier for me. That distracts from what I'm doing. And also, the easiest way, so this seems to be another aspect of the human brain that isn't very useful or it's not very good for us, for our thriving in this world, is that we are very tribal in our thinking. And it's one of the easiest things to do to manipulate people is to create an us versus them frame. To create a story in which me and my side are the heroes and they and their side are the villains. And what we must do is we must defeat the villains at all costs. And the more you believe that to be the case, the easier it is to manipulate you, and the easier it is, again, to get you to act against your own self-interest. Because if you believe that the other guys, the people on the other side, are just pure evil, they're pure evil, and if they gain power, they will absolutely destroy the country immediately. And they will come after your children or something like that. If you believe that, then there's almost nothing I can do that's bad enough for you to not vote for me. Because maybe I'm a corrupt bastard, and maybe I do all kinds of shady shit, and maybe I didn't fulfill any of my campaign promises, but at least I'm not a devil-worshipping baby eater, so vote for me, right? And this is a game that's being played in many countries to a kind of an escalating rate, where people are just being turned against each other to an extreme degree, and where people fall into these us versus them frames, where more and more they really believe that. They really believe that they are on the side of the good guys, and the others are the bad guys, and they must be defeated. And we are talking about people who live in the same country, right? We're talking about neighbors here who barely see each other as human beings anymore because of this, because they're successfully being tricked into these us versus them frames. And it's just another thing where you're being used against your own interest. Like someone else is playing a game with you when this is happening. And it's really subversive, because it takes all kinds of forms. It takes dramatic forms of political shouting, basically, and campaigning and marching and all this kind of stuff, where this story is told of how evil the other side is and how much we must rise against them, or how much we must remain in control, or something like that. Although, funnily enough, usually it's rising against them. So even so, if we have a simple system like a two-party system, even the party in power will still create a frame of being the underdog against the party that's not in power. And the most extreme example of this is, of course, would be basically like the Nazis versus the Jews, where even though the Jews are a minority, and even though as they're being prosecuted and driven out and so on, the story is still that somehow they're very dangerous and somehow they have more power than it seems. It's always like this paradox of they're at the same time, despicable and low lives and so on, but also somehow strangely powerful, and we must somehow overcome them. Because you always have to frame yourself as a hero. It always has to be a heroic struggle, right? So usually, no matter who is in power currently, the story is always that somehow the other side is somehow maybe secretly, conspiratorially in power or something, and we must rise up against them. And yeah, people are falling into these frames to a really dangerous degree. And this is, obviously it's not great for your mental well-being to be worried and fearful and hateful all the time. But also it's just a greater problem of what's happening to countries and societies as this carries on. And that's one of the things that we have to face and we have to learn how to opt out of. Oh yeah, and to finish the thought from before, so it takes these dramatic forms of marching in the street and stuff like that, but it also takes forms of entertainment, where there's just entertainment and memes and funny jokes about how dumb the other side, they're all idiots. Look at this idiotic thing, which is so this is a typical thing that happens. No matter which side you're on, there will be people who spend their time like finding the worst examples of the behavior that you're accusing the other side of, and turning that into, memes and jokes, and like on Twitter, right, dunking on the idiots on the other side. Look at this savage takedown.
Getting wrecked in the debate.
Yeah, this person has got wrecked in the debate, right? And it's always the best example of what we stand for against the absolute worst example, often just a made-up example because you couldn't find someone bad enough. So a made-up example of how bad the other guys are. And so even if you're maybe you think, I'm not really into politics, but you're still scrolling through a feed that's constantly showing you, look at these idiots on the other side. Look at these fools. Look at how evil they are. Can you believe this? Can you be, well, even if you're not politically active or something, you're still chuckling at it. And you still feel like, well, good thing I'm on the good guy's side, right? And right away, this is as a point of empathy, everybody listening to this podcast right now, no matter what country they're from, no matter their political affiliation, no matter, no matter how politically active they are, every single person is absolutely convinced that they're on the good guy's side. Every one of them. Which is actually a really optimistic thing, right? Every person wants to be on the hero's side.
Mm-hmm.
We all think that we are the good guys. We happen to be the good guys. We happen to be on the good team that deserves winning. And the other guys need to be defeated. But they are thinking that too. And in their reality, that is true. And I think that's something we have to understand, or that's one step, like gaining that understanding and understanding that this is a game that's being played and I'm a pawn in this game, whether I'm being all serious about it or whether I'm just chuckling at the funny political jokes. I'm a pawn in this game, and this game is not played for my benefit.
How do we opt out of that though? Because it seems that when you're in this tribalism of us versus them, it's weird because it's like you're very emotionally triggered and fearful, and you're down a rabbit hole, and you have a bunch of stories about why you're in this position and why the other team are not the right team, and those stories feel very real. So it's like just opting out of that doesn't seem like a simple thing to do.
No, it's
but
not.
But how do you do that then?
Yeah. So I think a big part of this is moving from online algorithmic spaces into real world spaces. I think that's one of the most important things you can do. So opting out of the attention economy is going to by itself change your view of a lot of this stuff because you're not exposed to all this messaging anymore. But also I think what you will find is if you, I don't know, if you go volunteer, if you do something for your community, if you do anything like that, that puts you in contact with people from the other side, in the real world, you will very quickly see that they're not monsters. You will very quickly see that you have far more in common with your enemies than what separates you and what differentiates you. And I think that this is one of the most important things you can do is take that interaction away from these online spaces and do real world interaction. And which also, don't be an activist on Twitter. Like be an activist. If you want to be an activist in your community.
Yeah. Yeah. So have you ever heard of a guy called Daryl Davis?
No.
Daryl Davis is a black activist who has, I think the last time I checked, he had over 200 conversions of Ku Klux Klan members in the United States.
Yeah, you have told me about this guy actually, yeah.
And the way he does it is he just arranges meetings with them where he'll just sit down and talk with them. And I think he's converted a fair few chapter leaders through doing this. And he appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about his approach and why it's so effective and stuff. And one thing about this dude is he is immediately disarming. Like he just has this sort of non-judgmental, non-triggering vibe about him. And he also knows full well why he does what he does and the effect it has. So, like fear, the way he describes it is, so hatred and anger come from fear. And fear comes from ignorance. Fear comes from that which we don't know. We just fear the uncertainty, the chaos, that what we don't know. And he recognized that a lot of these communities just had very limited exposure to black people. Yeah. And they were born into racist communities already. People that were saying that black people were this and that. And he recognized that as being part of the problem, well, the root of the problem, I should say. And he thought, how can I solve that? Just by speaking to them and just showing them that, look, I'm a human being as well. We actually have things in common. My skin's black, yours is white. That's probably the only, that's a difference, but
it's about as far as it goes.
It's about as far as it goes, dude. We've got a lot of similarities here. And I just thought I'd mention this story because it's really important how the success rate of his approach, rather than, because that is a person who essentially opted out of the us versus them. He could have easily gone, well, I'm a black person. they're racist. And he could have easily been emotionally triggered and given way to that part of himself and become angry at the problem.
You'd feel very justified, surely.
Perfectly self-righteous, it really would be. But this is why this guy is such an anomaly, because he's taken a completely different route about it that's leading to actually the success that most activism hopes to achieve, but not through the traditional route. And I think his example needs to be followed in that example for sure.
Yeah, that's really impressive. And for sure, we'll also link to this in the show notes. That's an amazing example, right? Because if a black man can reconcile his differences with a Ku Klux Klan leader, surely you can reconcile your differences with whoever's on the other side of the political aisle.
Surely. Yeah.
Also, to close this off, this also just reminded me of, and I'll try to find this video and we can also put it in the show notes. Reminded me of this really charming clip of some grandmother who met lots of people through a bed and breakfast or something like that. This grandmotherly wisdom where she said something like, all people are basically the same in the end. When they're cold, they want to be warm. When they're hungry, they want to eat. And that's basically it, but the way she says it is just like really charming. And it does seem to me like this grandmotherly wisdom where it's like, yes, sure, you're doing your thing and you're angry there and you're shouting here. But at the end of the day, you want to be warm and you need to be fed. And everybody's just this human animal, And I think that is, there is wisdom in that I think we forget and that we can be seduced into forgetting, is that really, like I said, there's so many similarities, but we have far more in common with each other. And it takes quite a lot of effort, actually, because it takes all this essentially propaganda, all this storytelling, all this machinery, all this distraction to get us to believe the other story, the us versus them story.
Yeah. And bang, right on cue, I've got another example, which is actually a really cool example. So about a year ago, I watched a 6-part Kevin Burns war documentary on the Vietnam War. And there was a part of this documentary that was really powerful because the one thing that's really good about this documentary is that it interviews members of the Viet Cong as well, just to see what their side was. And there was a guy who was a member of the Viet Cong and was talking in this interview about the moment when he felt emotionally moved, emotionally almost broken from the looks of it, when he was fighting with American soldiers, and the narrative that he had was that they were coming over to basically murder everyone, and that was the sentiment. But then he shot an American dude, and it dropped him, and straight away he saw that American soldiers would run in and would shield the body and try and take him away and this and that. And then he just in that moment of humanity, it was like, wow. I do that for my, I do that for my fellow soldiers too. It's like, and he mentioned that moment as being something that kind of showed him something. It's like, hang on, these are also people. Yeah. They're not just these soulless creatures that are turning up to just kill everyone. I shot him. He's screaming. His friends come over to drag him away, trying to save his life. It's like, Jesus.
Moment of recognition.
Yeah, it's like, we get shot, we hate it. They get shot, they hate it. It's like, quite a simple similarity.
All right. So I think that makes the point fairly well. So this is, and overall, just the idea is that pay attention to the things where you have to manage the impulses, you have to manage the world you live in, and you have to opt out in order to be able to have a successful, happy, thriving life. I think this is very important to realize. That's why we spent this much time talking about it. And this is also something where, think about who else needs to hear this.
Yeah.
Who else needs to have this pointed out to them? Because I think it's one of those things that once you see it, it's pretty obvious.
And the difficult thing is that there are a lot of people, this is considered normal,
Yeah.
Like a technology such as social media, which is young, already is considered very normal, which is a testament to how quickly something so bizarre can just be integrated into a society, to the point where if you leave social media, you're the exception.
Yeah.
You're the strange one. So opting out of some of these things, you may be alone in that. If you're in an environment or in social groups that don't share this view, you might be the odd one out. But that's still just conformity is not enough of a reason to stay opted into a system that's not serving you at all. So that could be a source of friction. But if that's the case, then just know that that's to be expected.
Yeah. And it's worth having this discussion, because if you're feeling the misery of this, if you're feeling the downsides of all this, and you feel like, well, maybe I do want to opt out, but then I'm going to be the odd one out. It's worth having this discussion with other people. It's worth bringing this up. It's worth pointing this out to other people because you're probably not alone. You're probably not the only one who wants this.
It's also worth going first.
Yeah.
Going first and seeing who follows, because I think you might be surprised.
Yes. All right. So with that, let's wrap it up here. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, this is something that I'd also love to get more feedback on. I'd love to hear more stories and more perspectives on this. It's a topic that is important to me, that I think is, like I said, kind of very basically important to human thriving. But it's also something where I've been out of this, or I've been seeing the world like this for a long time. I've been out of social media. Well, I was never really in social media to begin with. So I also think I sometimes lack that insider perspective. And I'd love to have a conversation, a discussion about this. I'd love to learn more about this, basically, from other people's perspectives. So you can leave a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave a comment there. You can leave a comment on our site below the show notes, which we'll also link to from the description. And you can also, there's also a thing you can click where you can leave us a voice message. If you want to leave a voice message that we can respond to in a future episode, you can also go and do that.
Do that. That'd be really cool. I'd really look forward to that. Actually having a voice note to respond to on an episode. But yeah, do that. Take care, guys. It's been a pleasure.